Okay, here we go um, with the first video lecture, or actually the second video lecture of the psychopharmacology course. I am going to try something here, and I'm going to see how well it works. I think that for at least part of part of the video lectures, I want to focus on a specific medication each time. And I wanted to start this course. I wanted to use this lecture to talk about lithium, since I know last time we talked some about it. So uh, again, so let me tell you a little bit about lithium, and then I'm going to pull up a video lecture or a video, some slides, some video materials that I will do a lecture behind, but I'll pull the video material up on the screen that talks about how lithium works. And I'm hoping that if I talk about specific medications, those will be good ways of obtaining practical information, but also go a little bit in depth as to what these medications are actually doing. Um, because I think that is a very important thing to try to get out of this course. What I'm hoping, since this is a doctoral level um, course on psychopharmacology, I'm hoping that what you come away with is not just sort of a basic understanding of of what medications do what, or what they interact with, or what sort of things are happening, but also a solid base of information about how these medications actually work, what they are actually doing. So I think if at least for a number, if not all of the video lectures, if I focus on a specific medication, we can really delve some into, well, what is this all about? What are these medications supposed to be doing? Uh, why are they doing what they do? How do they work? So eh, Vika, I'm gonna. I know you've had neuropsychology, so I think this is a good follow-up course. I hadn't thought till I started putting this lecture together how important it is to have neuropsychology first, because we're going to talk about the impact that these medications have on the brain and what they do. Let me start by talking about lithium. Lithium is technically called lithium carbonate, and as I brought up last class meeting, it is the oldest of all the psychiatric medications. And I'm going to share my screen here, and I'm going to bring up a lecture or a illustrated uh, material that talks about what lithium does. Now, these were lectures, video lectures, primarily developed for pharmacologists and for physicians. But I'm going to sort of walk you through the materials that are brought up here. Some of it's going to get technical, but when it does, I'll make sure to explain it. Like I said, I thought this would be one reason that talking about specific medications would be useful, because we could go through some of the terms um, that are particularly important. And it's interesting if you also consider this in the context of the psychopathology course that we had several semesters ago. It's interesting to consider how you will start seeing here some of the neurochemicals that we talked about in that course that were related to different types of psychopathology. In fact, it's interesting that I'm sure that if you go back to the stress and mental disorders book that we used in the psychopharmacology course, you will probably see a lot of the of the uh, of the neurochemicals that are mentioned in this lecture. So there's really, what's interesting is it's really interesting to consider um, how um, how these things come together. The stress hormones and the stress neurochemicals that we talked about in the psychopathology course connects to the regions of the brain that were impacted that we talked about the neuropsychology course. So we go from the psychopathology course to the neuropsychology course. And now the pharmacology course, the psychopharmacology course, is talking about what mechanisms these medications work on to try to make any sort of changes. Okay, so what we start with here is we look at the different areas of action that that lithium has on how the brain goes. So it works not only on the brain structures that we've had covered before, which is sort of the macro, the macroscopic level, and it moves down to the microscopic level, the different intercellular. So it has impact not only on the different areas of the brain, the different structures of the brain, but also on the specific neurotransmitters that are involved, and then also on the cells themselves. And you will see that this tends to be the case with all the meds. So all medications impact the brain on these three levels. So the main areas of the brain, the main macroscopic areas of the brain that tend to have the most, that tend to be impacted the most by bipolar disorder are the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the striatum. And you may remember the amygdala in particular being part of what's associated with mood. Bipolar disorder is a mood disorder. So that would fit. But we have three major areas that are involved with bipolar disorder. So when you go about figuring out, well, what medication is needed to address the variable levels of impairment associated with bipolar disorder, these are the areas that the medication is seen as needing to address: the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the striatum. So what tends to happen with I'm sorry, let me move up here. Okay, so so these are the areas. So what you tend to see in when you're using lithium is it tends to impact certain main areas of the brain, and some of it. So okay, so we go back up here. You see that the subcortical, the areas of the brain that are most affected, are the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the striatum. But you will notice that that lithium doesn't necessarily affect those areas. The lithium does not necessarily impact those three areas. It actually impacts three other areas: the anterior cingulate cortex, and it changes the amount of gray matter volume in this area. The superior temporal gyrus, and the ventral prefrontal cortex. So Other regions that are affected are the prelimbic system and the left amygdala. So there are parts of so the hippocampus, the amygdala, the part of the cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, the superior temporal gyrus, and the ventral prefrontal cortex are all impacted. Now, that those areas. Wait a second. So those areas are all impacted by those areas of the brain are all impacted by lithium. So here's the question. Why is that helping? What does that do? What does the increase in the gray area? So what you basically got is, in order to address deficits and problems that occur in these areas, you have a medication who, on its biggest level, on its macro level, impacts not only these areas, because each of these areas were listed. The stratum is part of the different areas, is included in the areas that we talked about, but basically address. If you think about it, it's not shown real well in these slides, but if you think about where these areas are, these are subcortical. Okay, these are sort of in the middle part of the brain. And what you're doing is increasing the gray area around these areas. So what you see happening here is what lithium does on a macro level. So the first thing lithium does on a macro level is increase the gray matter here, increase the gray matter volume, which is how these areas work. So it increases the gray matter volume here, but also by increasing the gray matter here, and by increasing the gray matter here, what you are doing is you are not only increasing the gray matter in these areas with lithium, but you are increasing the gray area surrounding these. So you're not only increasing the sort of area for neural activity in the areas most impacted by the areas most impacted by bipolar disorder, but also the areas around it. And that actually, this will come up with other medications, but it's particularly interesting with bipolar disorder because the medication impacting not only the areas of the brain impacted by a disorder, but also the areas surrounding the disorder. I mean, the areas surrounding those areas directly impacted. So the medication addresses the areas directly impacted by bipolar disorder, but also the gray matter around it is really, it's not unique to lithium, but it is part of what happens with lithium. And exactly why it works, to be honest, isn't quite clear. One of the things that's particularly interesting about psychiatric medications is that it's not always necessary to explain why the medication works. One thing we will bring up a number of times in this course is that psychiatric medications are the one type of medication where it's not considered to be a necessity to explain why the medication works, provided you can show that it works. In fact, with the FDA approval, psychiatric medications are the only category of medications where it is not required that a very clear explanation be given of why a medication works, provided that there is evidence that it works. So if for bipolar disorder you have, again, lithium, and you can show that people taking lithium have less severe bipolar disorder symptoms, you are not required by FDA policy to explain with absolute clarity why that is the case, provided you can show that there is evidence that it reduces the severity of symptoms and reduces the number of symptoms. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind about psychiatric medication. But so, you have these three levels that lithium works, and three levels that most psychiatric medications work. You have the impact on the brain areas, you have the impact on the neurotransmitters, and you have the impact on the brain cells. So again, the way lithium works in the brain areas is to increase the gray matter, not only in the areas impacted by or impacted in bipolar disorder, but also the gray areas, the gray matter in the areas surrounding the areas impacted by bipolar disorder. Okay, well, let's move down to neurotransmitters. So, what lithium tends to do is it lessens these two types of neurotransmitters. And these are, again, if you were to go back to the psychopathology book, you might find these terms in there. The two types of receptors that are overproduced in bipolar disorder, the two types of neurotransmitters that are overproduced in bipolar disorder are dopamine and glutamate. And so glutamate, it's called the new glutamate. And what is underproduced is GABA. So these are the types of transmitters that are most strongly impacted by or most strongly involved in bipolar disorder. There is an overproduction of dopamine and glutamate and an underproduction of GABA. So I don't know. I expect as we move on, we will be talking a lot about these receptors. But what I'd really like you to just make sure you are now is getting familiar with these, because we can talk and we'll talk, and it's covered in the book at different places, some details about them. But if there's nothing else that you get from this part of the course, what I'd really like you to do is start getting familiar with the names of the neurotransmitters and the neurochemicals that are involved. Because this is really where the medications have probably their greatest impact. I mean, at least if I had to say why that is, it may not even be that it has the greatest impact. It would be that it is what is most understood. The types of neurotransmitters involved in different types of psychopharmacology and the impact that different medications have on different neurotransmitters, that is more clearly understood when it comes to psychopharmacology, even more clearly than the impact that it has on specific areas of the brain and specific types of cells. So those other two are important, but this is probably where the information is most understood. So the types of neurotransmitters involved in bipolar disorder, again, overproduction of dopamine and glutamate, underproduction of GABA. Okay, and then let's get down here. So what I want you to sort of what we're looking at here, and I'll explain, this is what I'm particularly looking at here, is that this is where one of the reasons that I say we are most clearly understanding psychopharmacology and how it works because of the neurotransmitters is based on the fact that there are a lot more theories about what is happening with the neurotransmitters in different psychological conditions than there are theories about what is happening with psychopharmacology on different areas of the brain and with different cells. But here is the one. So this is the one of the ways, as I said before, that dopamine, that lithium works is by decreasing the production of dopamine or decreasing the impact of dopamine. And so what happens this is called the theory is the theory as it's called here. Hold on one second. Let me just grab something here and I'll be right back. Okay, I'm going to pull this back up. So, okay, now one thing I want you to understand here is this idea of one term you will hear throughout any of the material that talked about psychopharmacology is downregulation. And what downregulation means is that when a medication impacts the amount of an amount of a certain type of chemical neurotransmitter that impacts the brain's functioning. It doesn't actually decrease the amount of that neurotransmitter that is produced. What it decreases is the degree to which the neuron is impacted by the neurotransmitter. That is called downregulation. So, so by reducing, for instance, dopamine in the brain of a person who has bipolar disorder, what is actually being done by lithium is it is impacting on the neurons so they are less impacted by the dopamine that's in the system. Okay, so when it comes to bipolar disorder, there is this hypothesis, again on the neurotransmitter level, called the cyclical dysregulation hypothesis. So what this indicates is that during basically the general gist of it is that what tends to happen in bipolar disorder is that when the person is in a manic phase, there is this overproduction of dopamine. So dopamine is having much more of an impact than it would for a typical individual. And then what tends to happen is that basically this overwhelming impact of dopamine, because again, it's not that there's more dopamine being produced, but the the individual's neurons are responding much more strongly to the dopamine than might otherwise be the case. And then what ends up happening is basically it's that this overabundance of dopamine impact tends to send the person into mania. And then what happens is the this over impact of the dopamine basically sends the person to overload. So initially their response is to become manic, and it happens so often, and this elevated state occurs for so long that it basically shuts the neurons down to the impact of dopamine. So it goes to the opposite end. So basically, it's almost like when what can happen with a blackout in terms of electricity, that there can be such a surge of electricity that it basically blows the system out, and then there's no electricity. So it goes from this overabundance of electricity to shortly after there being no electricity. That's kind of an analogy of what happens in dopamine. That or what happens with bipolar disorder. That for whatever reason, the person's brain, the neurons in the person's brain are so over impacted by dopamine that it causes them to become manic. But while that's happening, what happens in their brain is that it shuts down to the impact of dopamine and goes on the opposite end, which is depression. Because depression, as we will see when we talk about the effect of antidepressants, depression occurs because of a decreased impact of dopamine. Okay, so what tends to happen, so basically what tends to happen is what lithium does is through a bunch of neurochemical processes, it evens out the impact of dopamine. And one of the ways that it does that is it also helps to decrease the impact of glutamate. And one of the things about glutamate is it often goes, well, in mania, it goes along with dopamine. So what lithium does is it evens out the person's response to dopamine so that it is not overly impacted by the dopamine. So basically, it evens out the person's response to dopamine, while also at the same time evening out or their response to glutamate, which in mania tends to go along with dopamine. And then what it also does is it increases the production, as we said before, of GABA. Now, what does GABA do? GABA, this is important because GABA tends to modulate dopamine and glutamate impact. So what you really have with lithium is this impact on dopamine and glutamate. Because even with what it does with GABA, it increases the production of GABA, but what GABA is primarily doing is impacting dopamine and glutamate. These are the two things. And what's interesting to keep in mind about what lithium is doing is it is really impacting mostly the chemical that is impacted in mania. Okay, because even when it impacts dopamine, it's impacting dopamine primarily in the way that dopamine impacts mania. It's just that the way that dopamine impacts mania tends to lead to the depression. And that is why you have some of these other chemicals, medications for bipolar disorder that primarily address the depression. You might have seen commercials where it will be commercials for medications that are specifically for depression related to bipolar disorder. The reason for that is because lithium, which is still considered to be the primary medication for bipolar disorder, primarily addresses the mania. It addresses the depression because the neurotransmitters that impact the mania send the neurotransmitters into overload, and then that tends to cause the depression. So it impacts the depression by impacting first the mania. And the idea is that sometimes some of the criticisms of lithium is that because it takes that pathway, it does not really impact the depression as much as some people might need. Okay, and then what I just wanted to go here as far as lithium goes is lithium impacts each of these types of cells, basically, but they're not really the cells themselves. They are the cells differ in a number of ways. One of the ways is how they communicate with each other. And so lithium tends to impact on what is called the cellular signaling system, which is basically the ways that the cells communicate with each other. And that's talked about some in the book. We can talk about that more in the class. I'm not going to go into detail here about that, except to bring up here, just I'd like you to just see some of these names. Okay, let's get down to what they say are the key points there about lithium. Lithium acts on multiple levels. It impacts by changing the brain structure, like I said, primarily impacting not only the hippocampus and the amygdala but also the areas surrounding the hippocampus and the amygdala. And then these are the three neurochemicals that are involved in lithium: dopamine, glutamate, and GABA. And like I said, the lithium primarily impacts these neurochemicals as they affect mania, and then they help with depression because it is the impact of these neurochemicals on mania that leads to depression. Then there are these different types of cells and cellular processing systems that are impacted as well. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I know you have other videos to watch as well for this course. Remember, they're under the assignment. Like I said, I think I'm going to continue using some of the classes to talk about specific psychiatric medications and how they work as a way of helping you to generally understand how psychiatric medications work. I will see you on Thursday.